Sorry, guys, I'm not quite sure what happened there. Back to where I was. So Gandhi was sentenced to prison as a result of the non-cooperation movement, and he was obviously charged with sedition, and he was sentenced in prison in 1922 for 6 years, but he only ended up serving 2 years of his sentence, supposedly because of medical reasons, and therefore he was released from prison in 1924. Now, in 1924, Gandhi doesn't immediately sort of emerge back onto the political and Congress scene in India, and therefore it takes a little bit of time for him to sort of gather a foothold or regain a foothold in Indian politics, and he primarily does this through the Bardoli Satyagraha in 1928, which you'll be able to read about within these pages. Now, just a little bit of context on the civil disobedience campaign then. On the 31st of January 1930, Gandhi announced an 11-point ultimatum for Lord Irwin. If these demands were met by the 11th of March, there would be no civil disobedience campaign, and Congress would participate in any of the sort of roundtable conferences organized. Now, the 11-point ultimatum ranges from interests of the elite all the way down to interests of the ordinary sort of lower skilled, lower class people, the lower class sort of the peasantry, the wider peasantry. So these were interests such as the reduction of military expenditure. And civil service salaries, discharge of political prisoners not convicted of murder, lowering the rupee sterling exchange rate, protective tariff on foreign cloth, and reservation of coastal traffic for Indian shipping companies. And for peasants, you have things like a 50% reduction of land revenue, and the abolition of salt tax and government salt monopoly. Okay, and this was a mixed package of points to appeal to a wide cross section of political opinions and to unite the Indians once again under one overarching sort of political leadership which would again be assumed by Gandhi, particularly after his sort of success in the Bardoli Satyagraha of 1928. And obviously, whilst that movement was a localized one in 1928, it basically became the stepping stone for Gandhi to launch this nationwide movement again and basically have another shot at it. And because the viceroy at the time, Lord Irwin, was in no mood to compromise, Gandhi began his the Salt March on the 12th of March. Now, even though obviously the salt tax was from the days of the East India Company, it showed Britain's imperial control over India. It was needed by all Indians, of course, as part of an essential, as an essential part of their diet. It was only 4% of the total revenue, so it wasn't as important to Britain. And Lord Irwin also remarks that he's not about to lose any sleep over a potential salt campaign taking place. But the important thing about salt is that it affected all sections of the population and had no divisive implication. It did not really threaten government finances because it only accounted for 4% of the total revenue, or any vested interest. So it would therefore not really alienate any of the non-Congress political elements, and nor would it provoke government repression. So it would be sort of a highly emotive issue with great publicity value. It was believed by the sort of Congress leadership at that time, and particularly Gandhi, that salt would be a great symbol to mobilize various elements of the Indian population, and that it would be successful in mobilizing the masses for his movement. So on the 12th of March, Gandhi marched. He commences historic march, Gandhi march to the Gujarat seashore, where on 6th of April he publicly violated the salt law. Okay, so the march attracted enormous publicity both in India and overseas, and it was followed by the wholesale illegal manufacture and sale of salt, accompanied by boycott of foreign cloth and liquor. in the next stage of the campaign, there will also be sort of non-payment of revenue in localized areas, and violation of sort of forest laws in the central provinces. Um, so this was a really sort of clearly um, defined program, which was outlined by the Congress Working Committee, and violence was really kept to a minimum here. Any sort of occasions of violent outbreaks, they were sort of localized, and they were contained. And this time, it wasn't enough for Gandhi to stop the movement as a whole. Although many historians argue that some aspects of obviously Gandhi's non-violence philosophy was broken, and therefore the march was stopped. Well, the civil disobedience was stopped. The campaign was stopped as a result of violent elements across India, across different regions in India. Um, so obviously, it began with the collecting salt found in creeks and along seashore to protest. Women began illegally manufacturing their own salt. Now, in this movement in particular as well, there is the sort of there is the sort of this is the occasion where we see the most participation of women. Okay, so women come out and participate in mass numbers, and this civil disobedience movement shows the largest number of women participating across all sort of in comparison to previous movements. Obviously, hundreds are arrested at the time as well. Gandhi, Nehru, and the entire Congress Working Committee was arrested too. It was showed all around the world, as I said before, so it gained mass publicity. If Britain responded, it would make them look petty, obviously because it only accounted for 4% of their revenue, and it would really be counterproductive for them to suppress such a movement. It did become a difficult movement to stop, as there was no central organization. Just like the non-cooperation campaign in 1920, many of these movements, many of these satyagrahas, they were localized according to the aims that people had, the different sort of caste and class people had in various different regions across India. And more powers were then obviously given to the locals, showing they could trust Congress. This also then reflected the diversity of the different provinces. By early 1931, Britain started regaining control of the situation, and 29,000 people are arrested. And this is as a result of the fact that the Gandhi-Irwin Pact is signed in 1931, and we'll come on to that next. To find out more about the civil disobedience campaign, it is essential for you to read these pages, which I will definitely put up for you. But also, when making your notes throughout the next week, please refer to pages 11 to 13 of the narrative, because they will provide you with a comprehensive understanding of this civil disobedience campaign. All right. So the Gandhi-Irwin Pact. Now, India and Britain at the time were at a stalemate, and the only sort of way out was a truce. Now, the truce was the Gandhi-Irwin Pact between Gandhi and Viceroy Irwin at the time. The civil disobedience campaign has been suspended, and Gandhi agreed to attend the second roundtable conference in London. 19,000 Congress supporters were released from prison. Confiscated property was returned to their owners, and some emergency restrictions were relaxed. Now, importantly, Gandhi had outlined many different sort of terms which he presented to Viceroy Irwin to get him to sort of suspend the civil disobedience movement. But Viceroy Irwin only really conceded to some of these conditions from Gandhi. Now, one of the most important things was that there was an abolition of salt tax, and obviously Indians were able to grow their own salt, to manufacture their own salt, and to also then sell salt themselves. Okay, so that was a major success for them. Right, the roundtable conferences. Now, the roundtable conferences are really important. The reason why the roundtable conferences are so important is because they begin to show how the inability of religious leaders to cooperate with each other sort of paved the way for the policy of partition in 1947. Okay, is as a result of these different religious communities, is as a result of their inability to work together, that partition seems like it is the only viable option going ahead. Now, first roundtable conference, all minorities were present, but Gandhi wasn't. It decided that India would gain dominion status, so that basically means that government would be federal with all provinces running themselves. Indian participation in all levels of government. So that basically means that provincial governments across India would have control over their own affairs, such as education, health, transport, but they wouldn't have control over things such as foreign affairs, defense, perhaps communications and trade as well. And those were to be central reserved powers for the British Raj. The Indian National Congress didn't want this. They wanted a united India, but the Muslims and the minorities didn't want a Hindu Raj. Now, the key thing here is that if India was united, Congress would dominate, as the 1937 election showed, and we'll come on to that. The reasons why the Muslims favoured a federal sort of structure is because they would still be able to have their Muslim majority provinces where their rights would be safeguarded. Okay, and that was the most important thing to them. They didn't want to they didn't want to concede to a Hindu Raj whereby the Hindus would dominate India, just as the British were dominating India during the Raj. Now, during the second roundtable conference, Gandhi attends, obviously as a result of his pact signed with Viceroy Irwin, and there's a similar mix of delegates. Now, all Gandhi did was show his arrogance by thinking he could represent all Indians. Okay, obviously I've touched on this before, but Gandhi really sort of was exclusionary here in his politics, and he alienated many different religious minorities by saying that Congress was the sole representative of all sections of Indian society. He believed that only Congress and himself were able to sufficiently and effectively represent all different sections of Indian society in the arena of Indian politics, irrespective of religion, irrespective of caste, irrespective of class. Okay, and this was really, really problematic. He thought that the Indian National Congress mattered more than minorities. Okay, but they didn't. He just wanted attention at this time. So Jinnah was a representative of the Muslim League, Master Tara Singh was a representative of the Sikhs, and Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar was the representative of the Untouchables. Now, they all had their own demands, which the Indian National Congress didn't like, as it weakened the nationalist movement. And Congress were arrogant in the sense that they thought that they should be the only ones that should be listened to. Now, the problematic thing here is that Gandhi and Congress, they were unwilling to give in to separate electorates for other religious communities, such as the Untouchables, such as the Muslims and the Sikhs and the Christians and the Buddhists. Now, this was really, 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 really problematic, and it was a political impasse for all of these representatives of all of these religious minorities and communities, and that did sort of bring the roundtable conferences to a stalemate. In the third roundtable conference, Labour lost its power. There were no Labour Party representatives or Congress representatives. It discussed franchise, finance, and the role of princely states, but no definite conclusions were made. Gandhi was imprisoned. The Indian National Congress outlawed. Youth organisations were banned, and within 4 months, 80,000 people are jailed. So the roundtable conferences from 1930 to 1932, they were a resounding failure. And their politics, Congress's politics during the roundtable conferences, was exclusionary of the interests of other religious communities rather than inclusionary, displaying how the inability of religious leaders to cooperate was a contributory factor eventually to the policy of partition. Now, the 1932 Communal Award. So Prime Minister at the time, Ramsay MacDonald, he announced that all minorities were separate. Therefore, they were given the separate electorates. Now, Gandhi didn't like this. Untouchables weren't separate from Hindus and thought Britain were trying to weaken Congress. So Gandhi began, obviously, as one of his sort of philosophy, as one of the sort of core underpinnings of his philosophy, he began a fast unto death campaign. And Ambedkar was forced to compromise with Gandhi. Now, Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar was a representative of the Untouchables. So they came up with the Pune Pact in Yaradva jail, in which Untouchables were given 18% of seats. Now, this was celebrated as Untouchability Abolition Week because Untouchables, the scheduled caste, they were able to gain representation in government. Okay. The 1935 Government of India Act. So the Indians couldn't agree on their own constitution, so Britain tried to create one for them. Conservatives joined with ex-generals and Indian civil service officers to form the Indian Defence League. Churchill believed they were incapable of running their own country and saw them as a great market for British goods, especially with the Depression. So Daily Mail obviously provided media support, as you could imagine, to the Conservatives at the time. And this was problematic because it showed that Britain was still committed to exploiting India to serve their own economic imperialist ambitions. So they argued that Gandhi and Congress were numerically insignificant. Now, the act itself, it said that India was to be divided into 11 provinces controlling everything but defense and foreign affairs. Each province was given its own assembly and government and governor. Diarchy was abolished, so diarchy, which was institutionalized or introduced first by the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms in 1919. Separate electorates were continued as before. Burma was separate. New states such as Orissa and Sindh were created. Viceroy was still appointed to overlook things, but now it is supposedly said that he had to follow the advice of the council, which was mainly Indians. Now, the Congress and Muslim League rejected the act. Congress wanted Purna Swaraj, which was basically fully fledged independence, and a strong central government to be predominantly Hindu. Now, obviously, the Muslim League, they were disappointed with the act because it didn't offer enough to Muslims, and so there was no guarantee or safeguard of their political rights. Now, as I stated before, it was really the 1937 elections which substantiated and advanced the fears of the Muslim leagues and the wider Muslim population of a Hindu Raj. Now, obviously, as a result of the newly created provinces, some of the newly created provinces and the Government of India Act, which outlined that 11 provinces would control everything but defence and foreign affairs, as that was outlined by the 1935 Government of India Act. The 1937 elections were the first sort of test of this Government of India Act, because it portrayed obviously a remarkable shift of power to the Indians, but it did cause a growth of incompatibilities between the Hindus and the Muslims, leaving Muslims feeling isolated once again as a result of the 1937 elections. So initially, Congress and the Muslim League didn't want to take part as boycott to Government of India Act, but they didn't want to lose power and votes in case the Muslim League won. Obviously, Congress didn't. So Congress gained overall control of the United and Central provinces, proving they did represent most of India. So if we have a look at this in greater detail, you can see that the Indian National Congress wins numerous provinces such as the United Provinces, Bihar and Orissa, Bengal, Assam, the Central Provinces, Bombay and Madras. Okay, so they win numerous provinces, and this was problematic for the Muslim League in particular. So Jinnah revitalized the Muslim League. He changed his appearance to appeal to Muslims. He wanted to create a Muslim identity where the ordinary Muslims would give him support. And he began a series of personal appearances, mass rallies to win Muslim support and votes before the elections, of course. They were afraid of Hindu Rajas. They saw Hindu congressmen taking advantage of their new role in parliament. And they appointed relatives to important jobs at their disposal, ignored minorities, and drew up fiscal policies to annoy Muslim landowners. In Bihar, cow slaughtering became illegal. Congress flags hoisted up where there was a Muslim minority. These results, of course, are incredibly problematic. Congress won 707 of the 1,585 seats. The Muslim League won a mere 106 of the 1,585 seats. Now, this election obviously showed that there was considerable reason for the Muslims to be fearful of a Hindu Raj, of an India which was Hindu dominated, and therefore they needed to respond to these results as a result of this growing separatism between the Hindus and the Muslims, and as a result of the lack of unity which was displayed between both religious communities throughout this decade, in particular, as a consequence of everything that has happened from the early 20th century onwards. I hope that's clear for today. I'll be back next week.